Hi, everybody. My name is Will Samuel, and today I'll be discussing my master's thesis entitled When Beavers Get Burned, Do Fish Get Fried? Assessing beaver effects on fish in a fire-dominated ecosystem. So to start out with a little bit of background about my thesis, and that is that wildfires are increasing in size, frequency, and severity throughout boreal North America. You can see on this plot on the right, the distribution of the boreal biome in green. And over here on the top right of that figure, you can see the distribution of wildfires in Alaska since 1984. That's in orange. And note that those two distributions line up really well, and that's because wildfires are the dominant disturbance process in the boreal biome. Like I mentioned, wildfires are increasing in size, frequency, and severity, and you can see that illustrated in this plot here, where wildfires have become more frequent and burned more area in recent decades. It's also important to recognize that beavers and wildfires have the potential to interact with each other. So this study published in 2020 by Emily Fairfax showed that beavers actually have the potential to mediate wildfire effects on streams. And they basically do this by damming the stream, flooding the riparian vegetation, which reduces the proximity of the fire to the stream channel. Kind of looking at that from the other direction, wildfires have also been shown to control beaver populations. So you can see here, this study from a national park showed that as the cumulative area burned increased over time, the number of active beaver lodges decreased, and a follow-up study 10 years after the fact showed that that population never really recovered. And it's important to recognize that both beavers and wildfires affect fish in numerous and complex ways. And especially when you're referring to beavers, beaver effects on fish can depend on the specific fish species, the life stage of that species, whether it's a juvenile or adult, etc., the habitat that it's occupying, and the flow conditions on any given day or year. And so what I'll be talking about today mostly is this interaction between beavers and wildfires and how they either work together or against each other to mediate fish habitat. My study area is in interior Alaska. It's a pretty large study area, about 21,000 square kilometers, which is larger than the state of Hawaii, Massachusetts, New Jersey, or Connecticut. And about a quarter of this has burned since 1984. You can see that illustrated as colored polygons over on the right. Vegetation across this landscape is driven by wildfire, and I think you'll see by the end of the population, there's an argument that fish and wildlife distributions are also driven by wildfire. And another key point is that this ecosystem is ideal to conduct a study like this in because it has such limited human influence. It's mostly undeveloped, so the wildfires in these areas haven't really been suppressed or managed by people except those close to development. Beavers have been trapped here historically, but not to the same extent as in the lower 48 and the rest of North America. And the fish populations are relatively widespread and abundant as well. So if there is any place where we're going to see the relationships between these three factors, fire, beavers, and fish, this would be the ideal location to see those patterns without any confounding human effects. And then briefly introducing my study species, Arctic Grayling. These occur in northern North America. In my study area, there are really widespread fish. And then there's a big body of literature that suggests that they require accessibility to headwater streams, high in tributaries, for population viability. So I'll jump back into this later in the presentation. So my thesis kind of comes together to this single research question, and that is, how do beavers mediate the effects of wildfire on fish? So the first objective that we're going to be going through today, it asks, how do fires affect beavers? And the second objective asks, how do beavers affect fish? So jumping into objective one, how do fires affect beavers? And here you can just see some examples of beaver habitat that's been affected by wildfire that I saw while I was out in the field. And for this chapter, since my study area is so remote and hard to access, we opted for a remote sensing approach. So I basically have my study area and I broke it up into sub-basins so that I could survey beaver ponds. And so these are 12th level hucks, if you're familiar with that. And then we surveyed beaver ponds using satellite imagery. So I had two surveyors and then I QAQC'd every single pond we found. And when we found a pond, we put a point down, we traced its extent by creating a polygon in ArcGIS, and then we collected some metadata about them, like their position on the stream channel, either a main stem or a side channel beaver dam, whether they were active, inactive, and how confident we were that they were created by beavers versus some other naturally occurring pond or mining or something like that. And then my goal was to model beaver density across the landscape as a function of these environmental covariates that we've discussed. So first on my list was wildfire history, things like time since last burn, burn severity, and then percentage of the basin that's burned. And then there's been a lot of studies that show that different geomorphological and hydrological characteristics can predict beaver distributions really well. So we included a lot of different geomorphological and hydrological covariates based out of the program NetMap. And then I also included vegetation, 30 meter vegetation pixels, basically percent vegetation composition from another remotely sensed model. So basically we ended up selecting 24 covariates out of that list, and I don't have time to go through all of these on the right now. And then we fit 12 different models with those 24 covariates. So different combinations of these models to see how these covariates interacted with each other. And then we ended up fitting the original set of models using the full data set. And we started to see a lot of noise in these. So we ended up actually doing these again and separating our data to just burned only and unburned only subsets. And then we used model averaging to understand the significance of each of these predictors across all the models we fit. So this is a form of multi-model inference. Jumping into the results, we located 890 beaver ponds throughout the study area, and we classified 420 of those as high confidence. We were very confident that they were created by a beaver. And that's what we used for our modeling. We found that there's a higher beaver density in burned areas, and you can see that over here on the right. Those red polygons are the historically burned areas, and you can see that there's just generally more ponds in those drainages. And we also found that burn basins had smaller ponds on average. And there's a couple different explanations for this, but my current running hypothesis is that the fires go through, wipe out all the old ponds and old beavers, like we saw in that study Hood et al. And then as new beavers begin to recolonize that habitat, the new dams are smaller on average. And burn basins also had more deciduous vegetation, which is completely to be expected as a wildfire goes through. That's part of the normal succession process, but that might be some of the reason why we're seeing these patterns of beaver density vary across the landscape with wildfire. So jumping into our models, wildfire, geomorphological, and hydrological parameters were really good predictors of beaver density across the landscape. Vegetation was important, but only in the absence of wildfire history. So in those drainages that haven't ever burned and we don't have any data for them, that's when the vegetation started to become important for predicting beaver density. So some of those key predictors from the models include basin area, sinuosity, stream width and depth, percent burned, severe burn, and moderate burn, and then vegetation composition, again, in those unburned areas. Okay, so jumping into my second objective, I wanted to connect this back to the fish side of things. And so here we're asking, how do beavers affect fish? And remember, I kind of discussed this big body of literature that shows that Arctic grayling need to be high up in tributary streams and river networks in order to be successful, and that they prefer these positions high in the watershed. So here I wanted to investigate how grayling navigate that, trying to get high in the watershed in light of all these beaver dams. So we wanted to start out by just calculating what is the potential habitat across this whole study area. So what could a grayling possibly inhabit? So for that, we built a simple distribution model, and we basically based this off of historical grayling observations from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, about 900 observations. And then we found a couple environmental parameters like mean annual flow and stream gradient, which were good predictors of those distributions. So we basically developed these thresholds, stream gradient, anything above 4%, and then below this mean annual flow was no longer considered grayling habitat. So you can see that over here on the right, where this light blue color is just the original stream network, and the dark blue color is what we are considering available or potential fish habitat. And then we wanted to compare that to what is the available habitat in these study areas in light of these beaver dams, these black points on the map. So to calculate that available habitat, I tried to do a lot of research, and there's only a couple studies out there that actually have empirical data on this. But I took those studies and combined them with my field observations, and we basically generated a 50% probability of passage. So whenever any individual fish reaches a dam, it has a 50% chance of getting over it, assuming that at all costs the fish want to move upstream. And so you can see over here on the right, as we assign a population of 100 fish down here at the bottom, they hit that first dam and half of those get through. They hit the second dam, and again, that population is cut in half. So now we're at 25% of the original population. At the next dam, again, cut in half, we're at 12% of the original population, 6%. And then eventually this is going to start to reach an asymptote nearing zero. And so I picked the threshold of 5%, and we considered anything above that no longer considered fish habitat. And then this cutting it all study showed specifically how important flows were for Arctic Grayling passage over beaver dams. So I wanted to develop these high flow and low flow scenarios. So for that, again, we looked back in the studies and my field observations, and we basically came up with an 80% and a 20% probability of passage. So over here on the right, you can see the 80% probability of passage scenario, or high flow scenario, when 80% of fish get past the first dam, 64 across the second dam, and so on, until you eventually reach that 5% threshold again. And you can see there's kind of a difference between how much habitat is available and compared to the potential habitat, which was on there a couple slides ago. Note that over here on the left, there's not enough beaver dams to restrict the grayling, so they actually go to fulfill their entire potential habitat in that scenario. Now that low flow scenario is not looking so great for fish. Here, they can only get past 2 dams with a 20% probability of passage before they're stopped. And you can see that most of that tributary is inaccessible to them. And the reason I picked this is because I witnessed multiple dams like this throughout my study area where the whole tributary was blocked from fish passage. And so I wanted to repeat this process across my entire study area using all of the real beaver points that I collected and summarize that habitat availability under these different flow conditions. And so you can kind of see those here summarized for the same tributary. And then we wanted to compare this across fire history and beaver density. So what we found was that some tributaries lost 65% of available habitat during that low flow scenario. So that's a pretty significant chunk of the tributary. And of course, those areas with high beaver density are the most vulnerable to habitat fragmentation. And so that means that these historically burned areas, the Chattanooga and Chena rivers that are circled here, those are the areas that experience the most fragmentation. And then if you want to summarize it in a table here, you can see that during these low flow scenarios over here on the right, sometimes up to 20% of that river basin was cut off because of beavers. And even during the normal flow, the 50% probability of passage, somewhere between 10 and 13% was cut off because of beavers. So it's possible that this is moderated across the landscape, during these high flow and normal flow scenarios across all of these river basins. It doesn't look quite as severe, but this could be a concern at kind of a local scale. And now comparing this to beaver density, this is a little bit redundant because this basically shows what the last slide did. Because what you can see here is as beaver density increases and you lower the probability of passage, the available habitat decreases at a faster rate during these lower probability of passages. So that is kind of redundant. But what's interesting here is that beaver density is not really well correlated with percent available habitat. And the reason for that is because these beaver dams occur in different positions of the watershed. So having a beaver dam at the very bottom versus the very top of the watershed will make a big difference in terms of how much fish habitat is made unavailable. So it's interesting here how variable this is, and it's important to note that the position of these beaver dams in the watersheds has such a great effect. So kind of wrapping this all up, my first objective found that wildfire is in fact a key driver of beaver density, and that geomorphology, hydrology, and vegetation are important, especially in those unburned areas for predicting beaver density. And my second objective found that beavers definitely have the potential to restrict fish habitat, especially during low water conditions. And this confirms the only other few studies that were in Alaska about beavers and fish, and that this can be really severe at a local scale, like a single tributary, but it's likely moderated across a landscape like mine. And now the key caveat here is that there has to be alternative fish habitats for those fish to move to. So maybe in an area that you guys are working, if you're working with much more human development or more habitat fragmentation, and these fish don't have alternative habitats, beavers starting to set up shop in the bottom of a tributary of a spawning or rearing stream could have a pretty big effect on the population. So that was my first chapter. The second chapter of my thesis is going to be kind of the field validation for this. So for that, I sampled throughout my study area using traditional fish sampling and environmental DNA. You can see my eDNA sites up there on the right. And then we're basically modeling fish occupancy across the study area using an N mixture model. That's still in progress. I don't have any results of that yet. But basically, this is the field validation to see if what I predicted in my first chapter is in fact correct. With that, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this project, my committee and co-authors, my technicians, my volunteers who I could not have done it without, and I'd like to thank my funding sources. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.